Okay, let's dive in. Have you ever looked at something, I don't know, maybe a really bright flower or just an orange and thought, is the way you see that orange, that specific color, is it exactly the same as how I see it?
Right. I mean, we both call it orange, sure.
Yeah, we agree on the label.
But that inner feeling of orangeness,
Hmm.
is yours the same as mine? That's the big classic question, isn't it? Really gets to the heart of it all.
And philosophers actually have a name for those private, subjective qualities, don't they? Qualia.
Qualia, exactly. It's the redness of red, the taste of, say, chocolate, that feeling of warmth from the sun, all that internal stuff, the texture of experience.
And for a long, long time, the standard thinking was that this stuff, these qualia, were basically off limits to science, locked away inside our heads.
Totally. Think about Thomas Nagel, right? His famous question.
Oh, the bat. What is it like to be a bat?
Exactly. And his point wasn't really about bats per se.
No, it was about what we can know objectively.
Right. You can know every single physical fact about a bat's brain, its sonar, how the neurons fire when it catches a moth, everything.
We still wouldn't know.
You wouldn't know what it feels like to be the bat. Using echolocation, navigating in the dark that way, that subjective side, considered totally beyond objective reach.
And then David Chalmers, he really nailed this down with his concept of the hard problem of consciousness. He basically said, look, explaining the brain's mechanics, the wiring, the processing, that's one thing. The easy problems,
Right.
relatively speaking.
Right, the functional stuff.
But explaining why any of that physical activity should feel like anything at all, why there's this inner world, this subjective experience, that's the hard problem.
And that really cemented this idea, that maybe qualia, these subjective feelings, were just fundamentally beyond measurement or comparison, forever private.
And this is why we're doing this deep dive. The sources we look at suggest that whole picture might be starting to, well, to wobble a bit, maybe even change dramatically.
Because the thinking now is, well, wait a minute. If experience, even subjective experience, is happening in the brain,
Okay? Which seems plausible.
and we're getting really, really good at measuring what the brain is doing, with tools like fMRI,
That brain scanning tech, yeah.
yeah, then maybe, just maybe, we can start to get an objective handle on these subjective states, maybe find patterns, things that correlate across different people.
So the big question becomes, can we actually measure something objective in the brain that lines up with these subjective feelings? And if we can, how similar is it between you and me?
Precisely. And that's what we're digging into today, this really exciting research that hints it might actually be possible now to measure qualia, or at least find really strong physical signs of them based on a pretty fascinating new study and some related ideas.
Okay, let's get straight to that study then. It sounds deceptively simple in its setup.
It does, yeah. They brought in 35 people, and they just showed them different colors, simple patches of red, blue, green.
Really looking
Okay.
at colors. That's it.
Pretty much. But crucially, while they were looking, their brains were being scanned using fMRI.
Okay.
And the core question was, does the pattern of brain activity that pops up when person A sees red look anything like the pattern when person B sees red? Is there a common signature?
A shared neural fingerprint for experiencing red, basically.
That's the idea. And what they found, well, it's pretty significant.
Don't leave me hanging.
They found measurable similarities, real objective similarities in the brain signals when different people were looking at the same color.
Wow, so wait. When I see red and you see red, there's actually something similar happening in our brain scans. Measurably similar.
That's what they found. Now, it's not like, an identical snapshot down to the last neuron firing. Our brains are way too complex and individual for that.
Sure, okay.
But the patterns, the overall shape of the neural activity, they were statistically similar,
Yeah.
consistent enough across the group for specific colors.
Okay, that feels like a pretty big deal. It puts a crack in that old wall, the qualia are totally private idea.
It really does. I mean, the interpretation, the claim being put forward is that this might be the first time we've actually put an objective number, a measurement, on something thought to be purely subjective.
By finding these shared patterns for seeing red.
They're basically arguing they've found a physical correlate, something in the brain that's stable enough across different people to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the underlying experience of red isn't wildly different between us either.
So going back to that first question, is your red the same as my red? This study is giving us a tentative, scientific maybe.
Structurally similar, maybe?
Hmm.
Perhaps. The researchers themselves are careful with the language. They say something like, your red is at least structurally and approximately likely indeed the same as my red.
Structurally and approximately. I like that phrasing. It's cautious, acknowledges the complexity,
Right?
but it still points to something fundamental, that the structure of the brain activity related to seeing red seems to have common ground across people, almost like a kind of basic neural language for color.
Exactly. And that's a huge shift conceptually. It takes it out of the realm of pure philosophical mystery and into something potentially measurable, something science can actually get its hands on.
And this isn't happening in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
This study seems to fit into a much larger trend we're seeing.
Oh, absolutely. It's part of this really exciting wave in neuroscience and even philosophy, trying to tackle consciousness and subjective experience head on with scientific tools and rigorous thinking.
Yeah, one of the sources brought up the work of Anil Seth and his colleagues, focusing on this idea called predictive processing.
Ah, yes. Predictive processing has become a really influential way of thinking about the brain. And Seth and others argue it gives us a powerful lens for understanding consciousness and even qualia.
Okay, break that down for me. What's the basic idea of predictive processing?
Well, in simple terms, the brain isn't just sitting there passively soaking up information like a sponge. It's actively predicting what's going to happen next. It builds an internal model of the world based on past experience and constantly makes guesses, predictions about the sensory input it expects to receive.
So my brain is basically a prediction machine, always guessing what's coming.
In a way, yeah. It generates this prediction and it compares it to the actual data streaming in from your eyes, ears, skin, etc. If there's a mismatch, if the world isn't quite what the brain predicted.
Like a surprise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's called a prediction error. And that error signal is used to update the brain's internal model to make better predictions next time. It's how we learn and adapt.
Okay, I think I follow the prediction error update loop.
Yeah.
But where do qualia fit into that picture?
Right, so here's the key idea in this framework. Qualia aren't just some weird byproduct. They're seen as key elements of this predictive algorithm. They're fundamental parts of how the brain constructs its best guess about the world and what's causing its sensory input.
Fundamental elements. What does that mean practically? Like, how is the redness of red part of a prediction?
Think of them as efficient ways the brain summarizes and categorizes information within its predictive model. Color, for instance, is a super useful way to carve up the visual world, right? It helps the brain predict how objects will behave, what's edible, what's dangerous. Qualia are like the brain's high-level labels or variables it uses in its ongoing prediction game.
So the feeling of red is the brain's prediction about a certain kind of surface reflecting light in a certain way presented to consciousness in this red format.
That's roughly the idea. They're part of the brain's internal language for modeling reality. And the argument goes, if we can really figure out the maths, the computational structure of how these predictions and corrections work, we might be able to understand the structure of subjective experience itself, find the underlying logic of feeling, which kind of mirrors what the fMRI study found empirically with those shared patterns.
So understanding the computational structure is understanding the feeling, in a way.
Or at least getting a very precise map of its structure. It's about
Yeah.
understanding the underlying logic, the structure of experience.
And it's not just theory. You mentioned there are actual organizations working on this.
That's right. The sources point to places like the Qualia Research Institute. Their whole mission, quite explicitly, is to develop a precise mathematical framework for understanding subjective experience.
Wow. A mathematical framework for qualia. That sounds incredibly ambitious.
It absolutely is. They talk about wanting to, get this, map the state space of consciousness.
Map the state space. What on earth does that mean?
Imagine trying to create a giant map, like a geometrical space, that contains every possible conscious experience you could ever have.
Every feeling, every sensation, every thought.
Everything, and not just list them, but understand how they relate to each other mathematically. What's the distance between feeling happy and feeling sad? What's the shape of the experience of listening to music?
Okay, that's mind-bending. Charting the entire landscape of consciousness.
Exactly, the whole terrain of subjective experience.
Wild. And it's fascinating, too, that even philosophy seems to be shifting alongside this. The field that traditionally kind of guarded the gates of subjectivity.
Yeah, the sources mention that shift, too. There's this recent book, The Metaphysics of Color, by a couple of philosophers, and they take a pretty surprising stance.
Let me guess, they double down on subjectivity.
Actually, no. Quite the opposite. They argue that colors aren't just in our heads. They argue colors are real properties of the world.
Real properties, you mean like mass or temperature are real properties?
That's the kind of comparison they're making. They essentially say, why should we consider color experience any less objective than our measurement of temperature? They're challenging that whole idea that color is purely internal and subjective.
So even philosophers are starting to push back on that strict separation between the subjective and the objective world.
It seems like it, yeah. Coming at it from their own angle, but arriving at a place that feels kind of aligned with where the science is heading.
Okay, let's try and pull these different threads together then. We've got the science, like that fMRI study, finding these objective similarities in brain activity linked to subjective color experience.
Right, finding those shared neural signatures.
You've got these big theoretical frameworks like predictive processing, trying to model how experience might be structured computationally.
Seeing Qualia as part of the brain's prediction machinery.
We have actual research institutes aiming to create mathematical maps of the whole landscape of consciousness.
The QRI and their state space mapping ambition.
And we even have philosophers questioning if things like color are purely subjective in the first place. So if this whole direction of research is actually onto something big, if we really are starting to figure out how to measure and understand subjective experience objectively, what does that mean? Where could this lead?
Well, I mean, if they're right, it could genuinely mean we're on the cusp of a fundamentally new understanding of experience itself. What it means to be something that experiences the world, not just for us humans, but maybe for any system complex enough, biological, maybe even artificial down the line.
The implications feel huge, almost scary
Yeah,
huge.
they really are. The sources touch on this. If you understand how experience happens, maybe you can start to understand how to create it.
Moving from just understanding it to actually synthesizing experience.
That's one potential path. Or, even more into sci-fi territory, perhaps, the possibility of sharing experiences more directly, brain-to-brain communication of subjective states.
Sharing what it feels like to be me, with you,
Ooh!
with other animals, other minds.
Who knows? It opens up some really profound possibilities, which I guess brings us to that very jarring example one of the sources used.
Yeah, that one definitely stands out. Who wouldn't want to know how it feels to breed a new human pandemic?
It's a really stark thing to say.
For sure. And it really throws into sharp relief just how far this could go, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The potential power and maybe the dangers involved in truly understanding subjective experience.
Absolutely. It's a potent illustration of the strange, perhaps ethically fraught territory we could enter if we gain the ability to not just understand, but maybe even control or manipulate subjective states themselves. It forces you to confront the extremes.
Okay. So wrapping this up, we've taken quite a journey here into this fundamental mystery of subjective experience, qualia.
Yeah, and we've seen how science, like that fMRI color study, seems to be finding ways to get an objective foothold, measuring things that were thought to be unmeasurable. It's like the door is cracking open.
And we looked at the theoretical side, too, with predictive processing trying to map the computational structure, and these institutes aiming to chart the whole landscape of feeling, alongside philosophers rethinking the nature of color itself.
It all kind of points towards the idea that maybe the hard problem, well, maybe it's not quite as insurmountably hard as we thought. Or at least maybe it's not impenetrable. We might actually be getting closer to understanding the very fabric of consciousness.
So maybe a final thought for you listening right now. If science really can start to quantify the texture of our inner world, if we can find brain patterns for red, if we can map the geometry of feelings, what does that ultimately do to our sense of self, our individuality? And looking ahead, what completely unimaginable forms of connection, or maybe just deeper understanding, could that unlock between us, or maybe with entirely different kinds of minds someday?